Thank you. I have studied economics on my own for the last 40 years. Also, economics was part of my doctoral program in international studies, but I do not have a PhD or a doctor of philosophy in economics. I am an amateur in this area. Even so, I feel I have reasonable understanding of economic problems. And so what I have to offer in this area is based on my experience. These authors I have studied, great economists, and also just plain thinking about it. I make no claims to absolute knowledge, but I think that what I have to say is important for the development of Thailand, and in fact, for any country. So I offer these points for your consideration, and that's all I can do. Now, I am certain that economic development through free markets under law helps promote individual, social, political, and economic integration. And I also am sure that the greater the integrity of the law and of the state, the faster the economy will grow and incomes rise. So I would say that the problem of economic disparities in Thailand, which are similar to those in my country of birth, Brazil, Latin America, everywhere in the world, including the United States, has to do with lack of economic or insufficient economic freedom and insufficient legal framework to support free economic action under law. In sum, the best way to eliminate poverty and make the citizen a part of society, because many of the poor are really not integrated, they feel that they're not part of the system, is to allow the natural market functioning to expand, and to create jobs without undue interference. So let there be economic freedom under law, as we defined law earlier today. Number 2 here, points. I read somewhere in the paper the other day that Thailand has the happiest economy in the world by some methods of judging. So I hope that Thailand will become even happier than it is. Now, I see that there is a desire for Thailand to grow, and I have an example to give that I think should be investigated, because it's sort of forgotten, but it's a very important example of how quickly the market can perform what it's supposed to perform. And this is the situation of Germany between 1945 and 1948 under American occupation, and the period from 1949 to 55, and even into the 60s, but especially up to 55, where a complete reversal took place. In the 1945-48 period in Germany, the Americans applied the Depression-era policies that they had become accustomed to in the United States. And these were, interventionist measures of the worst kind. For example, monetary growth, in other words, inflation, price controls to suppress the inflation, which they themselves had created, minimum wages, restrictions on hours of labor so that more people could be hired. And the result was that by 1948, and this was told to me by the economist, the German economist Hans Sennholz once, who later became, who was at the time a professor of economics in Pennsylvania. And this should not surprise us, because this is what happens, for example, during the Depression in the United States, 1933, under Roosevelt, until they entered the war in 1941 or so, 42. It's about 10 years of interventionist measures of the worst kind did not produce any results. People think and have been told that the United States, through the New Deal, so-called New Deal of Roosevelt, got out of the Depression. Now, the economist Henry Hazlitt shows in one of his books, I forget which one it is, either The Inflation Crisis or The Conquest of Poverty, in which he shows statistically that there were more people unemployed in the United States in 1938 than there were at the beginning, at the deepest level of the Depression in 1930, 1931, 32. So 8 years of economic interventionism had actually produced worse situation or no improvement whatsoever. And then in 1949, in Germany, Ludwig Erhard, who was a student of Ludwig von Mises, and if you know, they called it the social market economy, and it's based on Mises' idea of monetary discipline and a free labor market. So Ludwig Erhard and I believe it was Konrad Adenauer, I forget who was the other minister there was, president, went on the radio and said, "We will no longer obey the Americans. We are now free. None of these laws are to be obeyed. Everybody just go out and work and invest and do whatever you want to do." And the result of that was that out of 50% unemployment in 1948, Germany in about 6 or 7 years became the powerhouse of economics in Europe, surpassing the victors, France and England, who had defeated them. And I believe that this is something for Thai economists and policymakers to study, because the policies applied by Erhard and the German government, after they overthrew the Americans, so to speak, produced tremendous results. Sennholz was a young man at the time. I think he had just come out of the army. He was no Nazi or anything. He had to go. And he says that within about 3 months, there was very little unemployment in Germany. Of course, low wages. People were working long hours with low wages. And within a year or so, there was no unemployment whatsoever, right? And economic stability had returned, and people were investing and working and doing whatever they could. And by 1955, as I said, the powerhouse Germany was back in business. And around 1960, of course, I was a German student at the Goethe Institute in Curitiba, Brazil, trying to learn German. I never learned it. I was a bad student. But there was the German consulate, there was the German Institute, and we had this appearance that Germany somehow had become a new economic miracle. Now, I think that this is something that should be studied by those interested then in the promotion of a better situation very quickly, as quickly as possible here in Thailand. And people also talk about the Marshall Plan. They say the Marshall Plan of the United States, the injection of money from the Americans, inflated money, of course, was actually what brought Europe back to a better situation. Sennholz says the effect of the Marshall Plan was negligible, at least in Germany and probably in other countries, because the money went to politically connected people and never got down to, the majority of the population. Now, this is something else to think about, and I hope not to spend too much time. Time here would be number 3, please. Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky, the Russian writer, said something interesting, which should be a warning to economists and even to people who are involved in nation building, that you should not expect certain forms of behavior from economic growth. He says, give man prosperity, lots of prosperity, and still he will turn against you. Basically, right? Out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, he would play some nasty trick on you. Now, this is something that is very close to me because I saw it in the United States. The Americans, families who worked hard through the Depression, saved their money. After the war, they worked even harder, and they produced a lot of wealth, bought their houses and their cars, and their children didn't have any of this discipline and hardship that they had gone through. They simply had the benefits, the money, the cars, and so they became a superficial generation. And they turned to socialism in the 60s. And many of them to this day hate their own country and don't understand economics or are not even interested in economics, right? So this is when the importance of the Eightfold Path becomes of great importance, because it has the power to bring people back to their senses, even in the times of prosperity, right? So economic growth is necessary but not sufficient. And the moral center of the individual is the key to stability, and that's where we have this importance of education that we talked about earlier. Number 4, please. Now, legal private ownership of the means of production, what we call the market economy under law, or so-called capitalism, right, is not the cause of poverty. I think that we should know that by now, so that the whole Marxist, communist approach to economics has been defeated by experience, right? But the idea of socialism is still alive, right? Poverty has actually political consequences. It has political sources. Lack of integrity in the state, what we call bad government, corruption, and all these things, which lead to injustice and bad feelings among the people, and of course, sources of trouble for the government, right? Next, excessive population growth. This is something that I don't know if in Thailand the consciousness about this has reached the point of becoming a source of worry, but China, of course, has already perceived that this is something very powerful that has to be dealt with in some way, right? And this existing, so if the existing stock of capital cannot accommodate this larger population, always growing, then, as happened in England in the 16th and 17th century, if you read John Locke's report on manufactures, it was a problem at the time, so that John Locke suggested that even children 3 years old be taught a skill or something so that they could help their families produce something and sell something to sustain themselves. Now, excessive taxation, of course, is one of the problems. If you want to see excessive taxation, you should go to Brazil. For example, I just read the other day that 70% of the phone bill and of the water bill of the Brazilian is taxed, and only maybe 30% is real payment for the service. So I hope that Thailand, if it doesn't do anything, should do this. Do not use services as a way of taxation, all right? If you want to tax, then tax in some other way, but not through, in other words, your light bill, your water bill, your phone bill should not be a source of revenue. And the other one is, the excessive taxation, of course, leads to stagnation and collapse. The Roman Empire and the Muslim Empire of the late Middle Ages are two examples of how a government can tax its people to death. I remember as a result of, in reference to the Muslim Empire, that Ibn Khaldun around, I think, 1350s or so, perceived this, and he said to the leaders of the Muslim world, if you stop taxing the people, or your empire will turn into the sands of the desert. And that's what happened, right? And of course, the Romans taxed themselves to death also, to the point where the government confiscated everything. All land, all wealth, everything became part of the government, right? The other cause of political instability and poverty is monetary manipulation by the government and central banks, which we should call inflation. Of course, price inflation is a consequence of that, right? This leads to wild expansions followed by recessions and depressions. And monetary instability should not be part of government policy. Right? Now, monetary expansion beyond the natural pace of economic growth, in other words, monetary inflation beyond the natural pace of economic growth, leads to price inflation followed by depressions, as I said, unemployment, and worst of all probably is the erosion of the destruction of private capital, very slow destruction, so that at the same time that the economy is kind of limping along, whatever growth is being experienced is being taken away by the depression, so that you're actually not going forward, in a sense you're going back, right? And this is caused, of course, by political decisions or partisan decisions, not by the market. The market will work just fine if you remove those impediments and if you have different laws, right? As was known, in fact, even by Lenin, who knew that monetary inflation causes great trouble and can destroy a whole economy. And of course, in his case, he did it deliberately to destroy whatever was left of the Russian private economy, right? And the young John Maynard Keynes in 1919 already pointed this out, right? So recessions and depressions are a process by which bad investments, stimulated by the easy money policies of what's now called it's a devastating euphemism, are liquidated and market balance is reestablished. In other words, if you have a depression, a recession, let it alone. The market will solve the problem in about 6 months, as American experience in the 19th century actually proves. That those panics and depressions, which were caused at the time in the United States by manipulation of the gold price and of the silver price, caused depressions and panics about 3 times during the century, but the government did nothing to intervene. And in about 6 months, 7 months, 9 months, everything was restored to normal. Whereas, for example, and I said, in the 1930s and now under the Obama administration, the difficulty, all these economic problems lasted for 8 or 10 years. They just dragged on and on and on by inflating, by always putting more money into the economy, supposed to stimulate the economy, this so-called stimulus. It actually prevented the readjustments from occurring very quickly, which they will if you do not do that. So, do not interfere, right? The patient is in the hospital when the recession comes. Let the patient recover, and the patient will recover quickly. The market has amazing ability to recover, if you do not interfere, right? Number 6 here. So monetary inflation has another problem. It is a tax. It's not stimulus, it's a tax. It's an insidious, illicit, hidden tax imposed by those in positions of power, and sometimes even to enrich their supporters, as you can see in the American situation in the 19th century, in which in one case, the government, the president, changed the price of gold and silver in order to help a friend who was in financial trouble, right? So, beyond the taxing limit. So taxation is a great killer of economies. And I have an example here. Hernani Galvez, the finance minister of Brazil around 1983, and a Cajun, one of these second-rate Cajuns, he said, yes, we inflate in order to raise more revenue. In other words, they were producing quantitative easing, as it's called now, to hide the crime, in order to tax more, because at the same time the prices were going up, the wages and salaries and the payment of taxes were not indexed to accompany that. So people paid more and more in taxes as a result, which is why the government was doing what it was doing, right? So in this case, the government actually is evading its own tax laws in order to, while pretending to obey them, right? Number 6. Now, I believe that the Laffer curve is correct and should be paid attention to. In other words, low taxes soon lead to more growth and to more revenue. And government spending produces fewer jobs. There was a study, I think, done by some professors of the University of Texas, and they were confirmed by economists in Brazil around 1982, that of every money that, let's say, for every dollar that the United States government was spending to create jobs, if that money were not taxed or were not created by inflation and left in the pockets of the consumers themselves, it would generate 2 jobs instead of 1 job, and in some cases even 3 jobs, depending on the industry. So government attempts to create employment do not work. Let the market create the jobs, right? And the result is that if you tax lower, according to Mr. Laffer, Professor Laffer, you will actually, over time or soon enough, generate more taxable revenue than if you raise the rates, because people start to evade the tax rates and they go into the informal economy and they don't pay the tax. So high taxes are not only unjust, right? They discourage wealth creation and investment, leading to stagnation and even impoverishment of the whole population. And they weaken, of course, the foundations of the state. And I mentioned the Muslim Empire and the Roman Empire as 2 empires that tax themselves to death, right? Taxation policy, then, I think that this is the worst part of it, is that it affects the psychology of the people. It makes it, if it's a good policy, it can raise spirits. If it's bad policy, high taxes, it will depress the spirits. It can make people happy or it can make people unhappy. Normally, high taxes or taxes beyond a certain point make people unhappy. So let's talk about the monetary structure for a minute and, as a path to stability. There should be, in my view, and this is Hayek's idea also, that, in fact, I'm sorry, I learned it from Hayek and I agree with it, that market-created money under law should compete with the government money or central bank money in order to apply competitive pressure to whatever money is being created officially, right? David Friedman, the economist, son of Milton Friedman, mentions that instead of just gold backing, which is what we used to have, that the currency should be backed by a basket of commodities. That would give it more balance rather than just if you rely on gold, right? Now, Hayek and Milton Friedman both say that, okay, keep the central bank going, but let them act according to rules, not according to discretion, right? In other words, you stick to the rules. For slow monetary growth, I believe there should be no monetary growth, but I'll explain that in a second. Ron Paul, the retired now American congressman, wanted to abolish legal tender laws. In other words, not make the American or any citizen compelled to use the dollar, for example, or the currency of his government. That he should be able to choose the currency he wants on the market, and the government, the Internal Revenue in particular, of course, should be forced by law to accept this, let's say, taxes paid in Swiss francs or in Bitcoin as opposed to dollars. And that would also put pressure, competitive pressure, on the central bank in order to create monetary stability. Henry Hazlitt, the economist, suggested raising reserve requirements so you don't have so much liquidity chasing too few goods. And Murray Rothbard, the anarcho-capitalist, in his book, What Has Government Done to Our Money, actually suggests something that makes sense to me. He says that there should be zero monetary growth. Keep the monetary base as it is, and let then the market work with that and raise interest rates, promote savings, out of which you would have greater production. So you have a natural economy that feeds on itself rather than an economy that's always being forced or encouraged to use this extra money that comes out of the inflationary process, right? And the result of that, and he actually shows that this is pretty much what happened in the United States in the 19th century from 1800 to 1860, in which not only were wages, as a result of the market economy, doubling every 25 years in real terms, but the price level was gradually dropping by 30% during those 60 years. So that on one hand, people were making much more money in terms of salaries and wages, and they were paying 30% less in the prices of the goods they were buying. And that's one of the reasons why America became a very prosperous country, because it had, in spite of these panics that resulted from the manipulation of the gold price by the government, still on the whole managed to have significant gains, right? So this gently falling price level, in other words, it's a very, very slow deflation, which is a good thing and not a bad thing. And he also recommends, of course, in the current system, high reserves. He recommends 100% reserves. I think that does not work in the banking system. But certainly high reserves should something be taught. I think that this combination then of rules versus discretion, competitive pressures on the central bank, eliminating legal tender laws, compel the government and the taxing authorities to receive the proceeds of taxation in any kind of coin whatsoever, right? That would put significant pressure on them to behave. And if you have rules versus discretion, of course, then you have greater monetary stability. Now, another problem that we have in the economies of today that needs to be looked at is the question of labor unions. That would be number 8. Labor unions. Labor unions claim that they create employment and high wages. Not so. They get the higher wages because they create they create them artificially through violence and through slowdowns, breaking machinery in factories to intimidate the owners of the factory or the managers. And so they end up getting a higher wage. But if they're getting a higher wage out of the market, then somebody else, all things being equal, those who are not in the unionized labor force are getting less. And that's unfair, right? However, in times of inflation, we should not blame the unions for going on demonstrations or striking, because all they're doing basically is trying to restore whatever they lost in the inflationary process and recover the artificial wages that they gained illicitly, not illegally, illicitly, right? So, but there are intelligent ways of dealing politically with unions, and I want to suggest some things here in a minute. Historically, labor unions have to be understood as illicit cartels that were tolerated and sometimes encouraged for partisan reasons by different governments, right? Because in the democratic system where you have to generate more and more votes all the time, these unions can produce significant vote margins. For example, let's say if the labor union makes sure that every person, let's say in the United States, for example, let's say that every union member votes, and only in 50% of the unorganized population votes, then a union member is actually vote 2 votes and not just 1 vote, by comparison. And that's one of the reasons, they have so much power, right? Now, there are 2 types in the United States, at least. There are 2 types of labor unions. There are some that are simply organized crime, mafia, organized crime units. By intimidation, they simply control garbage collection in some areas and other services. For example, delivery, transportation companies, deliveries. And then you have others that are products of mistaken socialist thinking on economics, like revolutionary socialist units that follow Lenin's recommendation that you occupy spaces in order to consolidate power and to create conditions then for revolution and a takeover. This is not working so much anymore, except in Latin America and places like that, where communists and the United Left, as it's called, is still powerful. But even so, they're still losing some of their power. And both of these types of unions, the organized crime type and the Leninist kind of type, they are venal and corrupt, and they, due to the unlimited power that they're allowed to have. There's something wrong in the laws, So that's something. So how do we deal with that? Now, let's go to number 10, please. Okay, next. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. We should, with regard to unions, since they are organizations that have some purpose, they should be allowed to strike, but they should not be allowed to picket. In other words, they cannot surround a factory and keep other people from being hired at market wages because they want to have for themselves higher than market wages. So if you just eliminated picketing laws and say, okay, if you want not to work, stay home. You're allowed to strike. But you cannot come to the factory door or the factory gate or the bank gate and keep people from going in and out. This happened before the revolution of '64 in Brazil, which overthrew the socialists. For example, at the port of Santos, the stevedores, the longshoremen, which were controlled by the Communist Party, they simply refused to work, they picketed, and there were 300 ships waiting to unload in Brazil's most important port, and they couldn't unload, and they turned around and went away. And this went on for years, like for about 3 or 4 years. And for example, I remember when I was a young man going to school that the labor unions, let's say, would block entrance to the banks with their banners and their noise and everything. And you could not do business in the banks. What they're trying to do is create a revolutionary situation so they could take over. Finally, people got organized in the private sector and they got military backing and they overthrew this whole thing, right? So yes, defend the right to strike, but abolish picketing. That's one way to do it. And this is part of what I call the negative method of dealing with labor unions. I think that there's a positive method, which I will show in the next slide, that is actually more effective. But let's look at let's look at the negative method. One of them is, of course, as I said, deny picketing, right? Allow businesses to replace the striking workers at whoever wants to work at a market wage, right? Transform unions, for example, into benevolent associations involved in job training, offering health plans, job leads, information on where jobs are, and things of that nature, right? This should be, the law should transform them that way. Another one would be to require unions to invest, let's say, 3/4 of their investments, or at least a large portion of their investment, in the very industry that they work in. This would make them be interested in producing stability and greater profits, and it would be to the benefit of themselves and of the companies they work for, right? And require all persons in the corporations. This is something that's in an article entitled, and I recommend that you read it. It's a revolutionary plan. It was I think it's in 1982, it's in August of 1985, I think, August 4th of the Reader's Digest magazine. It's an article titled, "The Little Steel Mill That Could," which shows, for example, a type of industrial organization without labor unions in which everybody, including the CEO, gets a basic salary. And every other salary gain, let's say workers, for example, work for $10 an hour, almost like minimum wage. Everything they get after that comes out of production and productivity and new inventions and everything else that they can come up with. And so all other gains then depends on profit sharing after, of course, sufficient profits are put back into the corporation to keep it growing, right? This, as a result of this method, which was discovered in North Carolina in this Nucor Corporation, was that when the Steel Mill Workers of America came to organize Nucor Steel, they were defeated 420-3. They were totally rejected by the workers, the steel workers, because the workers understood that their salaries depended on their being at work and working together to make that company go, So sometimes depending on the market, they would make $90,000 a year. Sometimes when the market contracted, there was some part they made maybe $50,000 or $40,000 a year. But they knew that whatever they were getting was not because the owner of the steel mill was exploiting them, right? According to Marxist theory, the idea of exploitation. But simply because there's nothing they could do. That's the way the market was behaving. And that's one of the reasons why they rejected unionization. And the steel workers of America were never able to get into that factory, into that steel mill. And another thing that's interesting is that during that period when this started until 1985, when this article was written, not one person was sent away or laid off. All the people who were not with the factory anymore, with the steel mill anymore, were people who had simply quit because they moved away, or they had died, or they didn't want to work there anymore. But there was no person was fired, unless, of course, they were drunk or something. Of course, there was, but even that pretty much disappeared. And what happened was that even though they worked, let's say, Monday through Friday, on their own, they organized themselves on their own to come in on Saturday and set up for Monday morning so that they can hit the ground running on Monday morning and get started rather than, get started on Monday. So they would even give extra hours on Saturday, let's say 8 to 12, to prepare for Monday because they were interested in their own money and their own affair. There was no unionization, right? I think this is an article that should be read, something that should be thought about. Now these are all negative methods, right? Let's say I have a positive method here, which I think that if applied throughout the world will absolutely end the whole idea of unionization, socialism, communism, and all these things. And I hope that someday, if this idea of mine picks up, I'll be nominated for the Nobel Prize for Peace. Charter all unions as businesses, okay? As labor corporations that offer services to whoever wants services, whoever wants workers, right? And who sell quality labor products in competition with other labor business. In other words, there would be competing labor union, not labor unions anymore, labor corporations. Then instead of manufacturing automobiles or cell phones, they manufacture labor, right? Quality labor. And they try to place that labor in particular industries, right? So instead of seeing themselves, and I can see that, for example, this would lead to a great diversification in the training and in the approach to labor because some of these labor corporations would specialize in certain markets, and those are markets they would serve. And others would specialize in other markets, and those are the markets they try to sell their labor products to, right? So instead of seeing themselves as exploited people, dependent on a hated capitalist that will give them a job or not give them a job, these union workers then will become independent, associated businessmen, cooperatives or whatever, who produce and offer competitive labor products on the market, the same way that Boeing Corporation sells airplanes and Apple sells iPhones. And I think this would put an end, something like this chartering of unions as businesses, no longer as complaining revolutionary units, but compel them by law to organize themselves as businesses and sell their services on the market in competition with everybody else. And I think that this would put an end, total end, to what you call labor unrest. Everybody would be working for themselves, and of course, if they work well for themselves, the common good will be taken care of, right? And those are my suggestions on the economic front. Thank you very much.
Please give Professor Stelle a big hand.